Good morning, guys. I guess it's afternoon. I am going to talk now about how to tell a good scary story. And basically, this is building up on my own thoughts on some successful recent horror movies, some good classic horror stories. And basically, I've put it to an audio recording rather than a video so I can chop this up and edit it really well and put lots of images from different horror movies that I can put on here. I'm sure it's going to be copyright claimed, as my video on The Witch was copyright claimed, and I unsuccessfully disputed the copyright claim. Anyway, they have lawyers and stuff. I don't. Obviously, telling a scary story is important to me. My first finished novel, Go Out From Us, A Zombie Apocalypse, is a scary story. Well, it has scary elements in it. The scariness isn't the main focus, but nevertheless, horror, fear, mortality, all these things are important factors in the human equation. And so any psychological analysis of a person, you would want to include some aspect of fear. Fear is fun. The cinematic or literary depiction of fear it's fun. What can I say? It's fun to be scared in a controlled way. And I think the thing that people have said about this, why we like to be scared, is simply the adrenaline rush is overall a pleasant thing. So in the sense that the whole the fear, the adrenaline, the subsequent serotonins that our bodies release to make us feel better after the stress, all these things are in a way pleasant experiences. Escaping from trouble is a pleasant thing. Dodging a bullet is a pleasant thing. So how do you tell a good scary story? In my opinion, this is the chief thing for me. It's got to be relatable. Now, how a thing is relatable depends on the person. What scares a person is very specific to that person. For me as a child, there was nothing scarier than a knife-wielding maniac with a hockey mask. The effectiveness of the Friday the 13th movies was, well, it says something to me about my condition as a child, as a young teenage boy, why that made sense to me. But I mean, there's other factors at play too when you're talking about Friday the 13th. For a young, say a 13-year-old in how old was I? I don't know, let's say 1988, the chance to see women's breasts was also a highly motivating thing as well, which those movies always promised and delivered. Sure, it's still compelling today for me at 46, but I think that if it's a different circumstance, let's just leave it at that. It's a different circumstance. One of the and I say nobody haunted my dreams like Jason Voorhees did in my early teenage years, and I think he occasionally comes back these days, but not very often. The scariest movie I watched growing up was when I was, I guess, 11 or 12. I watched Nightmare on Elm Street at my friend's house, just the two of us in his basement at a sleepover, and it was terrifying. We didn't finish the movie. I guess we were too scared. Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street isn't quite as realistic in the sense that it's more supernatural. Now it depends which Friday the 13th you're comparing it to. It started off as quite realistic and became at times quite far-fetched, the Friday the 13th movies, but they were very different. They're very unequal in that regard. The idea of not being able to fall asleep and find comfort and safety in your dreams, yeah, that's something relatable. Okay, I think most people can relate to that. The fear of insomnia, the fear of not being able to find that escape, that psychological escape in sleep. Sure, that's relatable. And there's a lot of other things going on in those movies. Distrust of the older generation, conspiracies, pedophilia, whatever. I don't think it was pedophilia per se with Freddy, but there was a special interest Freddy had in children, which was never explored per se. Now, the movie that to me is quintessentially perfect for, as I said, realism or relatability is in the very opening of the, what was it, 2002 remake of Dawn of the Dead. It was a movie that erupted in the suburbs. It didn't erupt in the deep woods. It didn't erupt in this weird dream landscape, in a haunted house, anything like that. It opened up in the most, Dawn of the Dead was 2004. It was opened up in the most benign circumstance, and that is suburbia. And the opening scene with Sarah Polley realizing what has happened, what is happening, is in that but most benign of all settings, the white suburban affluent in a sort of, it looks like a sort of a newer development, and that if hell can erupt there, well, no one's safe anywhere, right? So that was effective and surprising. When you compare that tack with something more common, and that is to make the rural setting a scary place, like whether you're talking about Children of the Corn, or you're talking about The Hills Have Eyes, or any of the million movies set in, well, usually the American Southwest. In the case of what's the movie there with Burt Reynolds in it, in Appalachia? That's a rural setting, which is effective with city people because they don't know the country and it's weird and scary to them. So when we're talking about things hitting close to home, let me speak for a few minutes about the Paranormal Activity movies. So the first one came out in 2007, and there's been 4, I think, in total. Wouldn't surprise me if we get more in the future. They seem decently popular. Actually, sorry, it says here that there are 5 sequels, so I guess there's 6. Anyway, whatever the case, what it has going for it is the normality of the setting. So again, we're in a suburban house that I think 50% of, or more, well, whatever, it depends how you define it. Let's just say half the people in the United States and Canada live in an equivalent house. Ultimately, of course, you discover that it's actually it's a much nicer house than most people have. It's got a swimming pool. It's quite big and comfortable, and you realize that that's suspicious. It's comes about through the families packed with the devil or a demon or whatever. But nevertheless, it has that sort of everyday setting. It's not in some skyscraper. It's not in a shack in the woods. It's in that sort of everyday suburban setting, give or take. What it has its problems, of course. It's constrained by this found footage thing, where everything that you see in the movie has to come through a videotape or security camera or something, which is very limiting and becomes awkward and unbelievable at times. Several movies have gone down that path. The found footage thing is good too, and it's in the sense of the realism, sort of the grainy, textured, unfinessed footage that is more realistic. But nevertheless, to make a full movie out of it, it becomes quite the opposite happens. It becomes very inauthentic. So anyway, the setting, the realism, the relatability, as I say, relatability is key. If you want to scare somebody, you have to scare them where it hurts. And this was, well, a great deal of the original attraction of the Halloween movies had that going for it too. The first Halloween from the 70s there, late 70s, I guess, is just following a babysitter coming home from high school and going to babysit kid in a normal suburban setting, and there's some kind of stalker or something, and it's all very believable in that sense. So it strains credibility, of course, when you see how much Michael Myers in this case, the bad villain, how strong he is, how many bullets he can take, and all that stuff. It strains credibility. But nevertheless, it is set in a circumstance, a setting that a large number of people can identify with. But there are alternative settings, of course. There have been some pretty good ones set in more specialized environments. There was a movie recently, I can't remember what it's called, but something like The Vampires of Brooklyn or something like that. I'll put the real title here up on the video when I find it afterwards. And that obviously, there's a lot of people who live in cities and urban settings like the Bronx or Philadelphia or something, and those movies are more relatable in that circumstance. And I just saw the remake of Child's Play the other day, 2019 remake. Those are the Chucky movies, and they're set in a kind of urban apartment-y circumstance, which again isn't the circumstance I grew up in or I live in now, but is relatable anyway to a large swath of people. So setting is important, and different settings are going to appeal to different people. But nevertheless, just because it's not familiar, an exotic setting can have a good effect as well. When again, let me look back to the absurd The Hills Have Eyes. How many people have been to the deserts of Arizona or Nevada or whatever, and how many people live there? Not many, but in a certain sense, the opposite exotic location can have an effect as well. And that movie that was set on the Inca pyramid, and I'll put its title up here when I find out what it is. It was okay, and it had sort of that exotic setting, and other movies can thrive on those exotic settings. Movies like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, they're an absurdist kind of country setting, but nevertheless, they appeal to the imagination and fear of the unknown that many people have. So in this case, city people, right? Setting is important. Relatability is very powerful. So the exotic can't have, I don't believe, the same impact as the relatable. Not to say that there isn't a place for both. Of course there is. But the relatable is always going to be more powerful than the exotic. Relatability isn't the only thing. Exotic isn't the only thing. Texture, pace, all of these things are important. Now, when you think about texture, now we can think about the very bright, slow texture of Midsummer, the 2019 movie set in Sweden, or you can think about the grainy, gritty, black texture of various Japanese and Korean movies, The Train to Busan and the Grudge movies, The Ring, these textures. And obviously Texas Chainsaw Massacre has its own texture as well, which are either appealing or they're not. Now, there's some textures that don't have an effect on me, and that is the one that you would associate with such movies like haunted house, modern ones like The Conjuring and so on. These are textures that are too Sci-Fi Channel, too black, too artificial, too movie-ish. Psychology. Psychology is obviously very important. When you think of such classics as Psycho, very slow. It's an exotic setting for most people, but it is psychologically powerful in the way that it suggests various psychological forces at play. The psychopathy of Norman Bates and his bizarre relationship with his mother. There's other movies that do a very, very fine job with this as well. It Follows from 2014 is a wonderful movie for the same reason. It's slow, it's suggestive, it's disturbing, right? Rather than bloody and brutal. That's a wonderful movie for that reason. Other movies that play very well on the psychology, there's been some recent good ones. I'm thinking of Babadook was okay for that reason. And the 2008 movie Martyrs was brutal and bloody, but had a very powerful psychological element to it. I want to list a few more here because this is a very common thing these days in some successful horror movies. Two others in this camp would be Sinister, the 2012 movie with Ethan Hawke in it. 2016 movie Don't Breathe was wonderful. Stephen Lang, I guess, is the main character there. With movies with recognizable actors, there's a suspension of disbelief there, in that, familiar actors, there's a limitation there, that they're actors, you've seen them in lots of stuff, and that has a limiting effect almost. So in a way, it's often better to have an unrecognized actor to play in these things. In my glowing review of The Witch from 2009, the setting was exotic in some ways and familiar and scary in other ways. Sometimes comedy is okay, like The Cabin in the Woods was a self-aware parody of horror movies, but in such a way that didn't undermine its impact, the fearful impact. Shaun of the Dead, in a way, was a masterpiece of these two things as well. The ability to combine a feeling of jeopardy because you care about the characters, because they're admirable, they're humorous, they're funny, they're cute. It's just a very funny movie. Another genre that's come out really in the last 2 decades is the virus subgenre, I'd say. So the masterpiece in that field is 28 Days Later, and in my opinion, it's a very successful sequel, 28 Weeks Later. These movies are a different take on the zombie genre, in that they are not zombie genres like the slow-moving zombies of the rural setting made familiar through the Night of the Living Dead movies, but play on a different kind of fear, not a fear of the mindlessness and brutality that comes from the rural setting, but rather the efficient and devastating power of city violence. This is the ultimate expression. 28 Days Later is the ultimate expression of hate and fear in the urban setting, and also plays on something that we're becoming much more familiar with. It's our utter fear of disease. Okay, so it's a different kind of enemy. We can buy guns and protect ourselves against Texas Chainsaw Massacre guys or knife-wielding maniacs. What can we do against the virus? We know now how viruses make us feel, how pandemics make us feel. And of course, there are much more powerful versions of these. And another good movie that has combined this hygienic fear with the fear of man versus man against man, of course, is the wonderful movie The Girl with the Gifts. I'll have to put up its date. I don't have its date before me. The Girl with the Gifts was wonderful in this way as well, and thoughtful, and it had an element of science fiction to it that worked well. So in the end, The Girl with the Gifts, it becomes a story about evolution, about the heartlessness of evolution, and the loyalty to the human race, and so on. And other movies obviously have combined science fiction and horror very well, the best of which, of course, are the Alien movies. They're all, to me, they're all enjoyable in different ways. Some are great and some are simply enjoyable. And, and that connects us with the Alien versus Predators as well, and those types of movies, which are different but have subsequently become more intermixed, more merged together. Also worth mentioning and worth commenting on are the home invasion type movies. Now, the Purge series is overall, quite enjoyable. The initial one was very good, and a few of the others have been quite good. They began sort of as a home invasion type, to fit in the home invasion type genre, but have subsequently moved to more of the urban violence type movie, where there's themes of racial inequality, poverty, class warfare. But it originally began as a home invasion type movie. Other home invasion movies, such as The Last House on the Left, When a Stranger Calls, You're Next from 2011, The Strangers from 2008. I'm trying to think of a few others. There are a few others, of course. These have been long time horror movies, tradition, I should say, in the horror genre, and obviously plays on our fears of our home being violated, our sanctuary being violated. Now let me talk for a few minutes, and this will be a way to sort of circle back to my writing of horror. Let's think about the movie The Quiet Place for a minute, or A Quiet Place from 2018, and the new one, I guess, is dated 2020, 2021 maybe. Anyway, excellent movie, combines science fiction with several other elements of paranoia, home invasion, the survivor type thing, the vulnerability of of family and of loving relationships, the vulnerability that those things connote. So A Quiet Place is paced well, has those spooky moments of can we trust or can we not trust our neighbor, and of course the overwhelming force of some hostile power, and the role of human ingenuity in overcoming that threat. So A Quiet Place plays with obviously some of the themes that I explore in Go Out From Us, and also some themes that I am exploring as I write The Kids of Woodlawn Road, and that is about the deconstruction of society, the deconstruction of civilization, of coping with fundamental change from an undeniable cataclysm. There's fun there, believe it or not. There's fun in imagining what we would do if our world was turned upside down. There's fun and there's horror, and there's also, it plays on the ego of the reader or the watcher. What would they do? Would they be able to survive? Are they more clever than the protagonists in the movie? That they would survive where the movie characters or the book characters made mistakes. And there's nothing other than the fact that there are these alien invaders, these monsters. There's nothing in the movies The Quiet Place and Quiet Place 2 that is unbelievable in that sense. It's a woman who's in late pregnancy. She has a deaf daughter. She had a young child, a normal husband, and unextraordinary. He's not The Rock. He's not a jiu-jitsu master. He's a normal, caring father. These are things that are powerful, and for as much as superheroes appeal to us, there's less suspension of disbelief in that sense that we know we're not Superman and we'll never be Superman, but nevertheless, there's those movies have a certain appeal. The opposite is the case for the normal guy, the normal dad in A Quiet Place, the normal mom in A Quiet Place. That's another thing that 28 Weeks Later was about. It was about a loving father who was all too human. And that's realistic, and that's interesting. In my books, I try to make them very realistic and very relatable. My first book, Go Out From Us, is set in the environment in which I live right now, in rural Ontario, the Algonquin Forest area. And The Kids of Woodlawn Road is more my suburban childhood environment, which obviously I know very well, and that perhaps will and will not be appealing to people who have not lived in them. And this makes me think of Stephen King as well. Stephen King's great appeal for me in his movies and in his books is the relatability of the circumstance. His books are set in small town Maine, generally, and small town Maine is almost identical to small town New Brunswick, in which I spent a great portion of my childhood visiting my cousins and so on. And obviously it's not that different from suburban Nova Scotia, in which I actually lived. So obviously enough people can relate to and find something interesting in the unexceptional circumstances or settings of Stephen King's books. And one of my favorite movies of the last, I guess, 10 or 15 years is The Crazies. It's a remake of an earlier movie from the 70s or 80s. I can't remember which. But The Crazies is amazing for several reasons. And one of them is the slowness, the relatability or familiarity of the circumstance, this small town American, in fact, almost a rural setting, farmland, farm country, that again makes the crazies and the type of sickness in this case that we're talking about is not. And this, okay, so one of my favorite movies was the World War Z, but there were moments in that movie, okay, there were very powerful moments, but there was also moments of absurdity, as when the zombies sort of form almost a liquid wave to overcome the walls in Jerusalem, which were, I guess, yeah, it was Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, I suppose Jerusalem, which scene dramatically contrasts with the powerful scene where it all begins, sort of in the city street in New York, where they're in traffic and so on. The movie reclaims its pace towards the end in the laboratory in Wales, I guess it is. Of course, as I said before in a previous video from a year or two ago, the book is very different, the type of zombies and so on. In my opinion, this is what makes a good story. You take as realistic a setting as possible, as familiar, as realistic, as commonplace as possible, and you change one thing. Okay, so A Quiet Place changes one thing, and that is these horrible aliens. The Crazies changes one thing. There's this weird virus that turns people into psychopaths. And that's what my books do. They change one thing. Suddenly there's this, whatever it is, a virus or a something that changes one thing. And the artistic grace of the writer turns that into a relatable story. And that one thing they've changed, and they've changed in a horrible way, makes the story scary in a way that hits home. So going back again to the original Halloween, it's a normal everyday circumstance. The people aren't, I mean, Jamie Lee Curtis is beautiful, but she wasn't unbelievably Hollywood glamorous in the movie. You just introduced one element, one unfeeling psychopathic character. So that's my opinion. And everything, as Aristotle says, has to flow out naturally as a result of the world you've created. So that's how I see my books, and I hope that this you got something out of this these thoughts here, and I'll try to maybe I'll try to back up some of what I've said about my books with passages from my books to show that this is in fact what I've done. And if you don't agree with me, please let me know in the comments below. And if you have some comments of your own, say, hey, you forgot this movie. This movie is good for precisely the reasons you've talked about. And of course, I would be amiss if I failed to mention one of my other favorite horror movies of the last 20 years, and that is the Swedish Let the Right One In, which, again, you have a very normal world. You've changed one circumstance, and you haven't changed it in such a way to obliterate normal human psychology, but you have illuminated normal human psychology in a way that's made it interesting, enjoyable, sometimes beautiful. In this case, let me just say that when you think about the Let the Right One In, Let the Right One In is a vampire movie, which generally I don't like vampire movies. I like zombie movies because zombies they're not supernatural entities. At least, I mean, the original ones kind of were, but zombies, as opposed to vampires, are not supernatural entities. Recently I watched the remake with Colin Farrell, Fright Night, which was okay, but it was, comparing the believability and the psychological power of Let the Right One In compared to Fright Night, success versus lack of success. One is wonderful and imaginative and compelling and captivating. The other is just sort of entertaining, like a Hollywood movie. Anyway, guys, I wish you all the best. I hope you're having a great day, and I hope you get scared, because fear is fun. The controllable fear, the one you can shut off and think about at the end of 2 hours. All right, guys, let me know if I've missed any of your favorite movies. Have a great day.